Righty, folks, welcome, welcome, welcome. First of all, I'd like to inform you, as I said a couple of minutes ago, we are recording this event, so be mindful of that. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Avis Koyman and Srushi Suresh, for all their assistance behind the scenes that makes this and other webinars and events possible. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today for the first special online event of the semester titled Israel's Black Panthers, the Radicals Who Punctured, a Nation's Founding Myth, featuring Asaf Elia-Shalev, whom I'll present in a moment, so bear with me. I'd like also to mention that our next special webinar, titled The Future of U.S.-Israel Defense Cooperation and Trump's Second Term as President, featuring a stellar lineup of top policy analysts from prominent think tanks in the D.C. area, will take place on Monday, February 24th, between 6 and 7:30 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit israelstudies.umd.edu. My apologies. And now for the main event of the day. Today's talk is both timely and important. I know we are still consumed with the effects and after effects of the war in the Gaza Strip, but this is, I believe, another very interesting and relevant topic that we can address to better understand Israeli society and history from multiple perspectives. The Mizrahi-Ashkenazi divide remains a crucial lens through which we can understand contemporary Israel, the way this divide or schism shapes its social, political, and cultural landscape. While Israel was founded as the homeland for all Jews, deep ethnic and class-based divisions emerged, particularly between Jews of European descent, Ashkenazim, and those from Middle East and North Africa, Mizrahi. These tensions, rooted in disparities in socioeconomic status, political representation, and cultural recognition, continue to influence Israeli society to this very day. The founder of Israel's Black Panthers, the topic of today, a former member of the Israeli parliament, Charlie Beaton, died this February last year. A native of Casablanca, Morocco, Beaton fought for the rights of Mizrahi Jews in Israel. The organization he founded became a Mizrahi left-wing movement that combined ethnic and class struggle. In addition to their socio-political contribution over the years, the Black Panthers are also responsible, one way or another, for one of the most iconic sayings in the history of Israeli politics, when then Prime Minister Golda Meir said, "They are not nice boys," quote unquote. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Asaf Elia-Shalev, who is an award-winning investigative journalist working as a senior reporter for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency News, a nonprofit newsroom covering the Jewish world. He is based in Los Angeles. He's safe and he's well, but he has spent years working in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. As a Mizrahi Jew who grew up in the United States and in Israel, Asaf is attuned to cultural nuances and offers a unique blend of insider and outsider perspectives in his writing on Israel's Black Panthers. He is the author of the newly published book, Israel's Panthers, The Radicals Who Punctured, A Nation's Founding Myth, published by the University of California Press in 2024. As always, Asaf will speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we will open the virtual floor, quote unquote, for questions. Please feel free to type those in the designated Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will moderate those. Asaf, my friend, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eli. That was a really nice introduction. Helped me organize my thoughts. I really do appreciate it. And before I dive in, I want to point out that there are at least two connections between my work on this book and your campus. So Shai Haskani, a professor in your faculty who is on sabbatical now, provided feedback on the manuscript, really valuable feedback that made my book much better than it would have been otherwise. Another thing is that I did research on the book around the corner at the National Archives, where I found previously confidential documents in the American Archives about the Israeli Black Panthers. So that was really cool. And if you ever have a paper and you want to impress your professors, go to the National Archives. It's a really interesting place. Um, and now for my talk. And actually, one more thing, we're going to talk about definitions for just a moment because um, not everyone is familiar with the story. Although, if this is the Israel Studies Center, I assume it's more than the average person. But when we say Black Panthers in the United States, we mean one thing by that. In Israel, at the time of the Panthers, there were no what we, from an American lens of 2024 or 2025, consider black. There were dark-skinned Jews from Middle Eastern countries, and they referred to themselves as black, and society referred to them as black. And so we have to kind of take our time machine and think about things from the perspective of that era. Now, I want to explain what Ashkenazi and Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews means. Ashkenazi refers to Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe. They historically they spoke Yiddish. Now, Mizrahi and Sephardic, there's some overlap with those terms, but they do not mean the same thing. They both result from a mass historic exodus, different times, different eras, not related. So Sephardic Jews, that refers to Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492 and later on, and spread out throughout the Mediterranean basin, Middle East, parts of Europe, and they retained some of the religious traditions and cultures that they had in Spain back in the day. Mizrahi refers to Jews, some of them are Sephardic, some are not, who lived all over the Middle East, everywhere from Morocco to Iraq to Egypt to Yemen, even India further away, Turkey, and their mass migration was to Israel, where they came from very different cultures, and all of a sudden they were grouped together by the Israeli state, and a new identity, a Mizrahi identity, which means Eastern, was created. So some Mizrahim are Sephardic, but not all of them. There was independent Jewish communities that lived in the Middle East from way before the Spanish expulsion, and they retained distinct kind of religious traditions and cultures. And now we're ready to dive into the story, and this is really the third connection to you, particularly to the students that are on this call, because this book really got started when I was a college student at UC Berkeley. I came from an Israeli American family. I was raised primarily in the States. And I got very into radical politics at UC Berkeley, the school that's known for that, for activism. And I learned about the American Black Panthers that were founded next door in Oakland, California. And then I stumbled upon a reference to something called the Israeli Black Panthers. And I thought, what's that? And it said something about this was a movement that fought for the rights of Mizrahi Jews, or Jews from Middle Eastern countries. And I thought that was curious because my family is from Iraq. And I didn't know that I didn't ever feel discrimination in the United States. I knew that my Iraqi Jewish customs were a little bit different than what most American Jews were familiar with. But the idea that there would need to be a Black Panthers in Israel, that was odd to me. But so I wanted to know more, and I read everything I could. I talked to my family. I was really hoping, as you can imagine, a young radical activist at Berkeley, I was really hoping that someone in my family was a Panther. I was disappointed to learn that was not the case at all, but I still was I found it very interesting and to learn about my grandfather's arrival in Israel and my dad's experience and the shame he felt about his father, the shame he felt about being Iraqi, and how he overcame that and what he did, how he managed to find a place for himself in Israeli society and end up moving to the United States to seek a better life. And I was also reading everything I could about the Panthers and about Mizrahi history, but the internet, this is the internet of like 15 years ago, 16 years ago. So there was way less information, also less misinformation. So who's to say what's better nowadays or back then? But I was really frustrated at how little I could find. But it was clear to me that it's impossible to understand Israel or Israel and Palestine, the conflict or Israeli society alone, without understanding the Mizrahi story, without understanding that, wait a second, at least half of all Israelis, of all Israeli Jews, come from Mizrahi backgrounds. So that is completely different from what you might, or from what you're used to in the United States, where the default is kind of Ashkenazi. That's what everyone assumes a Jew is. We have Jerry Seinfeld, and well, actually, he's Syrian, but never mind. But the public persona or the stereotype of a Jew in the United States is very Ashkenazi. In Israel, they're of course Ashkenazim, but that's not really that's not the largest group. And you have to understand the experience they had in Israel. And so I was kind of letting go of my activism and becoming a journalist. And I, graduated from college. I moved to Israel to work at Haaretz, the daily newspaper, and I kind of fell in love. I was falling in love with this type of journalism known as a creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction, where you write not like a dry news story, but rather with characters and plot and dialogue and scenes, all fact based, but you're writing in a way that reads like a novel, or you're doing your best to structure the history and the reality in that way, and tuck in the analysis into the storytelling. And I was falling in love with this, and I decided after I met one of the Panthers, one of the founders, Reuven Abergel, I decided that I'm in my mid 20s. I don't really know how to write a book. I barely know how to write an article yet. And I decide that, maybe this is how I'm gonna make my mark. I'm going to make an intervention into the public debate about Israel and Palestine and write a book. In this style that I was falling in love with of narrative nonfiction. And my goal at the time was to kind of break up this binary that everyone had of Arab and Jew, Palestine and Israel. Wait a second, like there's actually the way power works is in Israel is so much more complicated. There's a whole hierarchy going on, and and to talk about Arabs and Jews kind of doesn't acknowledge the fact that most Jews in Israel come from families that a generation ago spoke Arabic as their main language. So that needs to be understood widely, and it kind of frustrated me that not enough people knew about it, and the Panthers were a great vehicle to tell that story. And so I went and interviewed every last Panther I could find, from Charlie Beaton to Kochavi Shemesh to Coco Derry, and of course, Reuven Abergel, he was the kind of the main character in my book. I went to visit about 12 archives, including 2 in the United States, one in New York and the National Archive in DC, where I found that the American ambassador to Israel at the time was sending telegrams back to the United States to who are these Panthers, what are they doing? Because they're a very scary group in America at the time, and now they're manifesting in Israel. So the American government wanted to know what was going on. So I take all this, and I put together like thousands of news articles that were written about the Panthers at the time. I found all this archival stuff. I found like secret police files that had been classified and stowed away. And I stitched together a story, um, and now kind of before I dive into that story, into the story of the Panthers, I need to give you some historical background to know how we got to the point where there was even a need for Panthers, where they came from. For that, let's go back to the 1890s, right? The late 19th century, when the Zionist movement, modern Zionist movement, was starting up. And it arose in order to solve a problem that Ashkenazi Jews were having, the problem of anti-Semitism and pogroms and marginalization, right? This was an idea, the solution to that that was being proposed was to create a Jewish state in Palestine. There were debates and alternatives, but that's the project, of course, that the Zionist movement settled on. And the idea from the very beginning was to create a European state in the Middle East, in Palestine. And we have Theodor Herzl's diaries, right? The father of modern Zionism. He wrote in his diaries, when we go to settle Palestine, the Germans will see that we too are German. Never mind that Herzl was Austrian, but the point he's making is that he bought into this European Eurocentric idea that there were certain races that were kind of elevated, superior, and the Jews simply were kind of misclassified as being the other. The Jews belonged among the Germans, and he wanted to prove to Europe that we're one of you. And he would do that by going to Palestine. Zev Jabotinsky, the father of revisionist Zionism, so he's the guy who founded the type of Zionism that Benjamin Netanyahu represents today, the right-wing Zionism. He wrote that establishing this Jewish state will push the frontiers of Europe all the way into the Middle East and towards the Euphrates River. So he's also explicitly talking about how this is a European project. The main problem with this idea was that the Jews of Europe didn't listen to the Zionist movement. They, in the early 20th century, vast majority of them weren't listening. Many did leave Europe, but they ended up going to the United States, which is why we have the robust Jewish community in the United States today. Then came World War II, where the Nazis exterminated 6 million Ashkenazi Jews, not only, but almost exclusively Ashkenazi Jews. And after World War II, there was still Jews left in Europe to heed the Zionist call, but not that many. There were the survivors of the Holocaust that were kind of broken down and not really the material that the Zionist movement even wanted. And then there were the Jews who were locked up behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviet Union wouldn't let them leave. And it's really then that the Zionist movement and then the leaders of this new state called Israel said, "Wait, we don't have enough people here in order to really have a Jewish state. We need people to man the factories, to be soldiers in the military, to settle the frontier." And that's really when they begin in earnest to look to the million or so Jews that lived all over the Middle East. And it's not an easy decision for them to make to look to this population to bring them to Israel, because remember, they wanted to create a European state, and they had just managed to they just managed to get almost 1 million Palestinians to leave the region. So now they were going to bring in another 1 million Jews who, yes, they were Jews, but they shared a lot of the same culture of the people of the Palestinians who left. So they were kind of ambivalent about bringing in this population. David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister of Israel, expressed how he felt about Mizrahim. We have government minutes where he says the Mizrahim are diseased, unmannered, prone to thievery, and prone to rape. That's how the prime minister thought about his fellow Jews that were brown-skinned and came from the Middle East. One of the chief correspondents for Haaretz, the newspaper I worked at for a time, in 1949, he set out to meet these Mizrahi Jews and come back and report back. And he was horrified at what he saw. He called the Mizrahim dirty Africans. And ordinary Ashkenazim were using a term called Schwarze Chaya, which, if you know in Yiddish, means black animal. That's how they talked about Mizrahim. I heard many people sharing memories of being called that as children. And so I was horrified to learn about this kind of racism, because this was only a few years after the Holocaust, when the Nazis, of course, used this kind of rhetoric to justify mass extermination. How did the Jews that found Israel not learn the lesson from the Holocaust that, like, you shouldn't talk about people this way, and not just about people, about your fellow Jews? It shocked the conscience for me to learn this, and but that's the kind of the historical truth, and it's very well documented. And what happens is if you kind of use this rhetoric around against a group of people, you see them as dangerous, you see them as disease-ridden, you're pretty well justified at taking measures to stop the threat that they represent, to protect yourself. So they bring in the Jews. Many of them are they're coming to Israel because they want to, and in some cases they're kind of also fleeing Arab governments that no longer want Jews in their country anymore. Um, come to Israel. They're expecting to be partners in the creation of a Jewish state, but there's the establishment, the Ashkenazi establishment, has a different idea. They treat brown-skinned Jews totally differently than Ashkenazim. They track them into poorer schools, into vocational schools instead of academic programs. They give them menial labor and close off opportunities to advance in the workforce. One of the most important kind of parts of this regime of discrimination is that they settle Mizrahim on the frontier of the country, not letting many of them not letting them live in the center in Tel Aviv, where there's economic opportunity. They force them to live in like these tent encampments in the deserts where they languish for years. And the idea is that we have to occupy as much land as possible to prevent the Arab armies from reclaiming the land that had been lost to them in 1948. And so there's kind of this tiers, these two tiers that are formed in Israel in the early from 1948 onwards. And into this mix, there is an early influx of Jews from Morocco, right? Mizrahi Jews from Morocco. And this particular influx, they come to Israel and they refuse to go along with the program. They decide that they had been praying to Jerusalem since time immemorial and forget the tent encampments in the desert. We are going to go to Jerusalem. That's so they go there, but there's not housing for them necessarily. No one's like providing them with housing. So where do they end up living? Well, Jerusalem was in this period after 1948 split into two cities. There was West Jerusalem, which was Jewish, and East Jerusalem, which was Palestinian and controlled by Jordan. In the middle was a no man's land. By that I mean neighborhoods that were kind of bombed out and didn't belong to either country. There was kind of the ceasefire, and this no man's land was surrounded by barbed wire. There was military positions from both sides above the no man's land, and Mizrahim, these Mizrahi Jews from Morocco, started pouring in by the thousands into these neighborhoods. One particular neighborhood where our story takes place is Musrara. It's right against the old city walls. You can see the Dome of the Rock from Musrara, from parts of it at least. And this was very appealing to these families. They wanted to be close to that religious center. But conditions in this neighborhood were awful because it wasn't officially part of Israel. There were no government services. There was no school for a while, and then there was like kind of a religious school where they used to beat up children. Their main interaction with the Israeli state was maybe police officers entering the neighborhood to arrest the kid who stole some fruit from the market. And it was kind of like this Moroccan Jewish ethnic ghetto that in many ways was like separate from Israel, and everyone was like living in their own environment. The young people, remember I said that David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, said that Mizrahi Jews were prone to criminality. Well, there were not many Jews in Moroccan jails back in the day, but when they come to Israel, they start becoming the criminals that Ben-Gurion thought they were, right? These conditions of poverty and oppression kind of generate a lot of criminality, and the kids get into trouble. They fill juvenile institutions. They're in and out of trouble. There's a whole generation of young men who aren't employed, aren't going to the Israeli military because they have criminal records, and so they're not allowed to serve. And they get organized by the thousands all over the country, in particular in the big cities, into what are known as street gangs. These are kind of gender segregated. So young men, the girls and the young women were still more beholden to traditional expectations and are more likely to be in the home. The boys were out on the streets kind of loitering and getting into trouble and having an attitude, but really not being productive in any way. And things could have kind of continued this way. But then everything changes like that. In 1967, a Six-Day War, uh, Israel conquers a lot of territory and unifies Jerusalem into one city. The barbed wire comes down, the borders come down. It is now one city, and it's arguably the most exciting city in the world suddenly. Musara was the backwaters of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was kind of the backwaters of Israel. And now that it's one city, Israelis from all over the country are flowing into these neighborhoods. They want to see the Dome of the Rock. They want to see, I mean, the Western Wall. They want to see the Old City, Mount of Olives, all these sites. They're going through Musrara to get to East Jerusalem. People from all around the world are suddenly rushing to see the holy sites that felt off limits because there was this tension and the threat of war constantly. So they're coming in, and what was happening in the world in the 1960s with the counterculture and radical politics and the revolutionary fervor. Well, that didn't arrive in Israel until after this war. Israel was kind of this province in this forgotten place, and now the hippie movement arrives, rock and roll arrives, psychedelic drugs, sexual liberation, and and of course the symbols of the revolution. So we have people like Danny the Red, who led the student revolts in Paris in 1968. He comes to visit. So you have and the kind of the Israelis that are best positioned to take advantage, who most interested out of anyone else in kind of imbibing this Western culture and this spirit of change that is flowing to the country, are these street gangs, and one particular street gang from Usarara, from Jerusalem. They um they love participating in this new age, in the hippie, the counterculture stuff. They start wearing their hair long. They start dressing like young people in the United States. Um, they're all of a sudden having sex for the first time. The girls in their neighborhood wanted nothing to do with them, but all these foreigners that are coming in, they find these young men very exotic, and so that's exciting for them. Um, they're participating. They want to learn about what's happening with um, the rebellious youth in all these other countries, and uh, they also are kind of starting to learn how to read. Right, many of them didn't have any schooling, and thanks to the help of these innovative social workers, that they're learning how to read. They're getting politicized by osmosis, but also through these like conversations and interactions they're having with the radicals who are visiting. And some of what they're seeing in the news really kind of triggers their imagination, engages them, and pisses them off. What pisses them off the most? They see in 1970 there's a wave of Jews coming in from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union finally lets out some Jews, some of them, many of them choose to move to Israel, and they come in and they are welcomed with open arms. They're given government benefits, tax breaks. They're lionized in the media, and these young Mizrahi men were like, "Wait a second, like, why are we still stuck in poverty? We never got government benefits. Like, how come they're being treated so well and being treated and being welcomed? We've been totally forgotten by everyone. Like, look at our communities. Our communities are broken." And they start to realize that what they're experiencing in their personal life is not just about them, it's about their community at large. Something's going on. And the other thing they read, one thing that was in the news a ton in Israel at the time was the American Black Panthers. The Israeli society was really fearful of Black American radicalism. The American Panthers were pro-Palestinian, and so they were accused of being anti-Semitic, and they were kind of this villain in the Israeli media. The young men in Israel and from Usura that read about the Panthers, they had a different interpretation of events. Instead of seeing the Panthers in America as a villain, they're like, wait a second, our main takeaway is that the government of Israel is very scared of these people. maybe we should be like the Panthers. Maybe, they have a cool aesthetic with their raised fists, their militant kind of organization, the name the Black Panthers. That's cool. We want to be like that. And it kind of evolves from there. They didn't really know what they were going to do, but they decided that they're going to have a protest, right? They're going to have a protest where they're going to demand an end to poverty, an end to crowdedness, an end to police brutality. That's a really important one. And the police are already infiltrating the group by this point. And they're like, wait a second, we can't have them. This is very scary for these young men to protest because they were aware of how much kind of dissatisfaction and unrest there was bubbling up from under the surface. And so the police officers go to their commander. The commander goes to the minister of police. And the minister of police comes to the prime minister, Golda Meir, and she calls an emergency meeting. What to do about these young people who want a permit to demonstrate? It's like, well, isn't that just free speech? Aren't people allowed to demonstrate? Well, it wasn't so simple. Clearly, the prime minister was concerned that she called up all her top advisors to talk to them about what to do. Remember, Golda Meir was raised in the United States, so she has, she's very sensitive about racial issues. She knows how explosive the black-white kind of thing is, and um, they have this meeting, and we have kind of minutes from that meeting where they debate what to do. Do we give them a permit to demonstrate and then kind of legitimize what they're saying? Because we're not, the official line in Israel at the time was, hey, we're all Jews, we're all equal, this country's for all of us, it's a socialist country, and there's no, these differences aren't real. Of course they were, but Israel is in denial about that. So do we give them right to protest and say, hey, there's something to what they're saying, or do we stop the protest? And how do we actually stop it? And would we just tell them no? I don't think they'd give up. How would we arrest them? What would we do? And I'm not, that's the cliffhanger. That's how I start the book. I'm not going to tell you what Golda Meir decides to do, but what she decides to do is kind of a massively consequential thing that leads to the movement kind of launching in earnest. And from there, we get I see we have not that much time. So we're going to go to questions in just a minute. From there, we have a movement that really, through street actions, through media appearances, changes society, leads to policy changes, way more budgetary allocations to social needs. Israel starts to create the modern welfare state modeled after Europe. We get an unleashing of Mizrahi creativity in the arts. People who are ashamed of their background are all of a sudden like really interested in exploring their Arabness. And every kind of social justice movement to this day in Israel pays homage to the Panthers. They really paved the way. A really important kind of difference between the American Israeli Panthers is that the American Panthers were real hardcore radicals, real Marxists that wanted to overthrow the American government and join with the oppressed people of the world and set up kind of the new something else entirely. The Panthers in Israel spoke a big game about getting rid of the state, or about they used phrases like by any means necessary. However, what they really wanted to is to belong. And that's true about Mizrahim in general. They came to Israel voluntarily. They wanted to participate and weren't given a chance to, and were maligned. And that was quite kind of confusing and aggravating. Like, why would we be treated this way? And they insisted on belonging. And the Panthers were kind of the vehicle through which the Mizrahi public learned to assert its rightful place in Israeli society. And that's why eventually Israel went from a country that really wanted to present itself as a white country, a European country, to today where it's very proud of its multiculturalism. Israel is very glad to have representatives internationally who are of all the different of Israel's vast diversity, and that's thanks to the Panthers. And it's thanks to kind of that unleashing of that rebellion that something ironic happened. It gave rise to the right in Israel, because the person who knew how to capitalize on this energy better than they did, the Panthers weren't disciplined enough for long enough to turn their movement into real power, electoral power. But Menachem Begin, the founder of Likud, Netanyahu's party, he knew what to do. He said he played on kind of nationalist sentiments, and he told the Mizrahim, he invited them to be kind of at center stage and be partners with him in kind of retaking and taking power from the old establishment. And that's an alliance that lasts to this day. So to understand why Netanyahu's like been in power for as long as he has, you have to understand the relationship between the Likud and the Mizrahi public. And there's so much more to say about all of this, but I know we need to go to questions. So I'm sure some of this will come up in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Elia. That was very insightful and very, very interesting. We do have a bunch of questions in the Q&A box. I'd like to ask the audience to add more questions. I have a list, a bunch of those. Sorry, you can't see because of the screen, but I have a bunch of those nevertheless. Let's go back to the question of kind of terminology or vocabulary, so to speak. Can you talk about kind of try a bit more operationalize the difference between Sephardi and Mizrahi? What does it mean in practice? Is there kind of a social political difference when they arrive in Israel? Or is it just semantics? Is there something deeper there?
Well, Sephardic was kind of the blanket term that was used in the 1950s to refer to anyone who came from the Middle East and North Africa. And yes, the government treated people from Europe differently. They said, I mean, we have government meetings where they're like, oh, well, Polish Jews were coming in, they need proper apartments. These Jews from Iraq, they can make do with like tin shacks because they're like they really believed, the Ashkenazi Jews really believed what Europeans believed at the time, is that people from outside of Europe were like cognitively deficient. So they thought that these Jews who had been in Muslim lands for so long were dumb because of their exposure to their Muslim neighbors, and so they created this category of Mizrahi, which is kind of an odd category because Morocco is to the west of, it means Eastern, and Morocco is to the west of much of Europe. And then Mizrahim went ahead and kind of took up that term, Mizrahi, as a term of pride, as a coalitional term, similar to how we have people of color in the United States today, where, of course, not all people of color are the same, but people use it in order to create political solidarity. And so that's how that term was used. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. Hold on, I have a couple of questions from the audience. David Siegel, who's a very good friend of ours here. Weren't the Ethiopian?
The
Sorry.
Ethiopian Jews did not arrive in the 1930s. They arrived in the 1980s.
Yeah. Some of them arrived in the 60s, kind of late 50s, early 60s, but kind of sporadically. The main one.
Yeah, very small.
Oh, sorry, my apologies.
But we could speak. A lot of people always ask about the Ethiopian Jews. Yes, they faced racism in Israel. The issue is they were a much smaller group, so they never threatened the character of Israel the way that the Mizrahi wave threatened. So yes, there was racism, but there wasn't this strong need in order to like protect the society from the Ethiopian Jews. So, well, there was some awful stuff they did to them too. It just was a different dynamic when you have a very big group of Mizrahim versus a relatively small group of Ethiopians that are arriving.
Okay. And again, one of the comments that you made was about kind of the Ben Gurion kind of approach to Mizrahi Jews, to Sephardi Jews. Not to defend, but certainly to put it in context, he had a very particular view of all immigrants, in a sense, even Holocaust survivors who arrived post-1948, calling pretty much everybody human dust, quote unquote. And by that, and I found the quote because I use it oftentimes, and he said, those who immigrate, even from Europe, they're a mob and human dust without language, without education, without roots, and without being absorbed in tradition and the nation's vision. This idea of mamlachtiyut and the notion, this kind of social engineering effort to try and create the new Israeli or the new Jew, if you wish, kind of applies all across the board in a sense. So it's not just against those who are black or brown, but those who were not Israeli enough, perhaps, in the eyes of Ben Gurion, who kind of represents this establishment, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. Of course, the Zionist movement wanted to reshape the diasporic Jew. That's a huge part of it. But what they envisioned, I I mean, I'll put it this way: the people who founded Israel's education system believed that yes, the European Jews from the diaspora, they needed to be refashioned, but no one believed that their cognitive abilities were lower. Whereas Mizrahim, they really thought that they like were not capable of abstract thought, and so they wanted. It was actually it came from a place of wanting to help Mizrahim. They've been damaged by being in the Middle East, so we want to help them. They're not currently capable of abstract thought, but maybe in a generation or two. So yes, everyone was affected by the New Jew project, but Mizrahim were affected in a different way.
I got you. All righty. Moti asks, how do you explain that today's Mizrahi Jews in Israel, out of many reasons, revenge is prominent one, would only vote right or extreme right-wing parties which do not necessarily identify with liberal and former European ideas, but would blindly follow an Ashkenazi Jew who arguably thinks of them as lesser citizens even until this very day. My apologies.
Well, it's very easy to like look at the Mizrahim and say they vote right. Every group in Israel has moved rightward over recent decades, and no one like talks about that. No one like labels that. No one groups them together. But everyone likes to talk about Mizrahim voting rightward. I would say a few things about that. I think that when Mizrahim come to Israel, the people in charge call themselves socialists and
Yeah.
liberal, right? But they are very clearly discriminating and hoarding all the resources themselves. So what good is this socialism and liberalism for me if like it's only benefiting one group? So it's just hard to take that seriously. Whereas the right in Israel and deregulation, free enterprise system, even though that was devastating for many poor people, many Mizrahim did really get social mobility out of Likud free enterprise policies. There were a lot of small business owners that were able to make it. There was Mizrahim also went from being overwhelmingly poor to there's a very very large Mizrahi middle class. So the Likud, for many people, not for the lowest tier, did deliver change. So you remember that. That's socioeconomically. Politically, you come to a country where Arabs are the enemy, where Arabic is shameful, and you look Arab, you speak with an accent, your grandparents or your parents like are straight up seem very Arab. That is shameful. And what do you do with that shame? Becomes self-hate. And how do you deal with that self-hate? How do you prove that you really belong in this country? By becoming ultra nationalistic, right? And there's also a practical thing, like when Mizrahim, the kind of the stereotype, which is based on, you see this, that might wear a kippah or a Magen David, even if they're not particularly religious, and that is so people don't confuse them for being Palestinian. If you look Arab and you have a big backpack on, you get beat up by police because people might think there's a bomb in there. Like there's actual practical reasons to like not be confused for an Arab. And of course, like it sucks for Arabs who experience this as well. So the other piece of this I want you to remember is historically because Mizrahim were settled on the frontier of the country, they were often the ones to suffer the greatest from Arab attacks, from when the wars were happening or Palestinian militants were attacking, or during the Second Intifada when buses were blowing up. Like poor people took the buses, and Mizrahim were overrepresented in those groups, and so they experienced the violence in a way that maybe some elites were more insulated from. And so there's all these dynamics going on. And yeah, why did they vote for that? Everyone votes to the right. Is there any left in Israel? I don't, not really. There's a lot more to say about that, but we should go to get more.
I got you. I mean, just a comment that there were kibbutzim on the front line as well, right? And terrorist attacks took place both in Jerusalem as well as in Tel Aviv, in Dizengoff, and other places, Haifa and others. So I wouldn't just argue that there's a kind of
no, it's not. It's not. Of course, it's not neat. There's no neat kind of separation. I agree.
I got you. All righty. We have a question here, does your book go into any discrimination by all Jews, even the ones that were being internally discriminated to other groups of people? In other words, Druze and Bedouins. Do you do kind of a comparative just to put things in kind of perspective at the time, in real time almost?
Well, I know.
No.
I think I mentioned this in the book that from Israel's founding until what is it, 1966, the Palestinian citizens of Israel live under martial law, so they have no civil rights whatsoever. So that's a comparison. You can make of that what you will. But no, but my book is not is not a academic, right? It was peer reviewed, so it's academic in that sense, but it's like it's a story of people, and um, so I focused on the Panthers and the Mizrahim.
So let's focus on the people. So they took, oh, they saw the model here in the United States, the Black Panthers here in the United States. So can you talk about what they kind of picked and chose at the time? Was there something that they kind of rejected? Was there kind of a all or nothing approach, or were they more selective or more critical of what they kind of decided to adopt?
We have to remember there wasn't the internet. There wasn't that much information flowing. They maybe got like a magazine cover, or some like anecdotes from people, or with conflicting kind of I saw the Panthers do this and I saw the Pan, or maybe they got, a poster or something. So they didn't really have a good sense of what was happening in the United States, a very accurate sense. They borrowed some of the aesthetics. They never organized into they never had like a military thing where, the Panthers in America, they had a whole arsenal of weapons. Like they had a small
Right.
military. Israeli Panthers didn't have that. And they also didn't like wear berets and organize into like paramilitary forces because that wouldn't have been a radical thing to do in Israel because the paramilitary aesthetic belonged to the state. So that was like the establishment thing to do. Um, and the American group was also way, way, way more organized, and was able to achieve a lot more. They really they had breakfast programs, they had schools, they had a nationwide infrastructure. They lasted for years and years. The Israeli group were really more of a protest group
Mm.
that was kind of wearing the Panther thing almost as a costume at first, and then it became its own thing that's authentic. I'm not calling it fake, but it really wasn't the same as the American version.
I got you. There's a question here, but I'd like to kind of rephrase it with your permission, perhaps. Um, were Mizrahi Sephardi Jews who emigrated to Israel Zionists? Were they religious, and then as a result of that, made the decision to emigrate to Israel? Was it a case of pushing, pulling? They were pushed away from their home countries to somewhere else because now there's a state of Israel back established in May 1948. What's the motivation there that led to that
There's,
immigration?
yeah, so it's impossible to say in one sentence to paint that in broad brushstrokes because there's so many different contexts. In some countries, there's definite push factors, right? In Iraq, the Jews are pushed out by 1950.
Yeah.
In Morocco, they're not. Most Moroccan Jews didn't leave until like the late 50s and 60s, and they left. They left because the end of the French project in Morocco was taking place, and so there wasn't room for them. Not necessarily because they were pushed out through violence, although there were instances of violence. Um, each country kind of had its own thing going on. In terms of were they Zionist or not. So there were all over the Middle East Zionist activists for a long time. So there were my grandfather, for example, joined the Zionist underground in Baghdad and helped. And when it came time for the Jews to leave and move to Israel, he helped put them on planes and organized the Exodus. He was the cog in that machine. He was not like a big shot. Um, I think that most Mizrahim were Zionists in the sense that they were the Zionist movement was very secular, right? They had a very secular orientation, and they were trying to find a political solution for the Jews. Mizrahim were much more engaged with religious tradition, and they saw the creation of Israel as a sort of miracle, and it resonated with them because they'd been praying to Jerusalem. They'd been praying for a return. That is the promise of, when the Messiah comes, the Jews, the kingdom is recreated and all that. And so there was very easy for them to tap in, for the Zionist movement to tap into that energy, and for them to kind of plug in their understanding of the world into the Zionist narrative. And so they didn't have the same, for the most part, they, aside from the Zionist activists, most of them weren't Zionist in the sense of the Ashkenazi pioneer Zionist, but they decided to make Zionism their own, and they once they come, yeah, they're very much buying into the Jewish state and the creation of all of that, and they just see things in a more religious through a more religious lens.
So let's shift gear for a second, and for a second, my apologies. Was this a story of success? Were the Black Panthers a success long term, from your point of view?
Yeah, it depends who you ask.
I'm asking you. You're here, so
Yeah. The problem I'm having is I'm pretty pessimistic about what I'm seeing in Israel right now. So it's hard for me to tell you. The society does not strike me as a very healthy one. And the Panthers, I think, offered alternatives that Israel ultimately, it took part of it. It took part of what they offered, but um, it it kind of also corrupted what the Panthers were about. And as the left, right, there were a left-wing movement that led to the rise of a very right-wing party. They were successful in the sense that they led to Israel abandoning austerity policies, economic policies that where people had to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and Israel created a very robust safety net that exists to some extent today, and that's a success. I think the fact that Israel's in general not ashamed of its diversity is a success. And in terms of like making, Mizrahim made massive strides in Israel. Like there's a lot of Mizrahi rich people there, in arts and entertainment and music and media. There's a lot of Mizrahi representation. You have to remember, Mizrahim couldn't make it onto the radio for decades, and today that's not a problem. On the other hand, there is still everyday racism. There are still places where Mizrahim have not reached. Like, there's never been a prime minister who's a Mizrahi. The main government ministries, like the defense, treasury, foreign ministry, are always tend to be, not exclusive, but tend to be led by Ashkenazim. The judicial system, right? The judges in Israel, overwhelmingly Ashkenazi. Academia, right? I think something like 92% of Israeli professors are Ashkenazi. That leaves 8% for Mizrahim and Palestinian Israelis. So there are still all these realms where there is an old elite. And I think, so I think many Mizrahim benefited from the energy that the Panthers unleashed. Israel, in many ways, I think, has squandered its Mizrahi. If Mizrahim were never seen as an asset to the country, and they squandered it, and they, whole generations of people weren't allowed to make contributions because they were seen as lesser, and that's a real failure. Panthers also, we haven't talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Panthers really offered an important alternative vision for Israel that ultimately was abandoned by the country, like the pursuit of the two-state solution. The Panthers endorsed the idea of a Palestinian state in 1975. So that's, almost 20 years before the Oslo Accords. When no one in Israel was talking about the two-state solution. It was considered illegitimate. Like the Palestinians didn't, their right to self-determination wasn't recognized by Israelis. And the Panthers said, wait a second, we're never going to be able to live in this region in peace if we don't kind of solve this conflict with the Palestinians and learn how to share this land. There's kind of mixed mixed bag in the end.
Okay, so let's talk about, it seems like you said, Mizrahi singers were not able to have the records played or the songs played on Israeli radio. This is not necessarily the case anymore, right? Eyal Golan and Eden Ben Zakir and others are, top of the hits. They can fill major venues, including what was known as Yar Eliyahu, and so on and so forth. Does that mean that the mission accomplished, so to speak? Israeli society has transitioned from a anti to a pro-Mizrahi culture, more Mizrahi, values in that sense?
Yeah, it's changed in many ways, but there's still, the grievances are still alive, very much alive. Just a year or two ago, a kind of one of the central operatives within the Likud party was told, I think a newspaper was quoted as saying in the newspaper, the Nazis should have finished the job and killed you all. Like that's a reprehensible thing to say. That's an awful thing to say, and there's no justification for that for anyone.
Yeah.
It does reveal, however, that grievance is alive, or at least that there's a perception the grievance is alive enough that he was trying to galvanize something based off of that. Of course, everyone on the Likud distance themselves from that. So every time there's elections, this stuff comes up. We'll see.
What is known in Hebrew, Ashed Adati, that is out of the bottle, this ethnic genie or whatever the
ethnic genie. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, so can you talk, we have a couple of more questions, but I want to plug one more of mine before we switch to the audience. Yuda Shenav, Vicky Shiran, Keshta Demokratit, and others started talking about Arab Jews in that sense, in Israel. Is that a kind of an extension of the Panthers' argument? Were they trying to connect into this part of their identity? You talked about the two-state solution. Was it from a kind of a geopolitical perspective, we can't win, so let's try think peace? Or was it, we need to connect with the region, with the area where we are actually located, where some of us come from?
The Panthers, and they're at the time, definitely did not call themselves Arab. Let's be clear. I did not see a single instance of calling themselves Arab. They described themselves as a bridge to the Middle East, a bridge to the Arab world. And they thought that they could do a better job at diplomacy and at coexistence than the Ashkenazim were doing. And later on, yes, there's a group of people, is Mizrahi intellectuals, highly educated intellectuals, who kind of come up with this, but like embrace this concept of the Arab Jew. I don't use that term. I have no problem with other people using it. I'm not like, I think that it is an interesting, provocative idea. And there was a time in history where there were Arab Jews. That was a thing, right? There wasn't an impossible, that hadn't dichotomized yet. In the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, all these identities were in flux. Even the meaning of Arab wasn't stable. Like, Egypt wasn't an Arab country yet. Like it became an Arab country, right? There were Coptics and there were Bedouins and like there were different groups. And then the Arab identity kind of coalesced, and Jews like could have been part of that if it weren't for this clash between Arab nationalism and Zionism, if Jews weren't kind of expelled out of Arabness. If any individuals want to identify as Arab Jews, more power to them. Most Mizrahim don't do that, and I'm happy to embrace the terms that Mizrahim use. And I identify as a Mizrahi Jew. Like I feel like if I put on the hat of Arab Jew, I'd be claiming more than, like, I'm not connected to my Arabness in that way that feels authentic to me.
We have a question from the audience. How does Netanyahu maintain his power when he's so right-wing? But just to connect it to this conversation, perhaps, has the base, his Mizrahi Sephardi development towns base, stayed the same? Is it the same base that Menachem Begin won the elections in 1977 with? has there been any
Yeah.
demographic, social, political changes there?
Well, the Likud's electoral power is much smaller than it was during Menachem Begin's time, so that's kind of worth knowing. How does he stay in power when he's so right wing? I just want to say that Israel is a very, very right wing country, so it should shock no one that the prime minister is right wing, right? That in itself makes total sense. You know, like Israel's like 90% right wing, 80% right wing. There aren't many countries like where it's that stark at this point. Um, the base, you know, has shrunk a bit, but for the Likud, but other right-wing parties kind of took more of the electorate. So, in that sense, no. We'll see if he's, you know, after October 7th, he was like deeply unpopular. It looked like it was finally the end. Now, Netanyahu has won over a lot of Israelis again. We'll see what happens. I want to take you back to 1973, which was kind of the death knell of the Panthers. 2 years after they're founded, we have the Yom Kippur War. There's this existential crisis. In many ways, the vibe of that moment of this war was similar to October 7th. This total mobilization of society, this fear, this existential fear, and no one wanted to talk about internal divisions anymore. Right before October 7th, there were weekly protests against the regime, drawing tens of thousands of Israelis, right? Those stopped right when the attack happened. And then all the protest groups became groups that support the troops, that support the victims of October 7th. What's going to happen long term, we don't know, but I'll remind you, right after October 7th, right after Yom Kippur War, there's an election, like right after that. Golda Meir and the Labor Party still won that election,
Cool.
which is odd, or which is like may not make sense. It took a few more years for that party to lose power and for Menachem Begin to come to power in 1977 through the what's called the revolution, or the Mapach. And that election was very clearly a rebellion against the old order. Now, the fact that Bibi still maintains power makes sense. We're not out of the crisis of October 7th. I do expect a paradigm shift as a result of everything, and it's not going to be immediate, just like it wasn't immediate back then. I don't know what things are going to look like. Probably settler messianism is kind of emerging as the more dominant force in Israeli society. Right, a version of the right that is religious. That's the rising force in Israeli politics nowadays.
All righty. So last question of the evening, perhaps, with your permission. What was the vision of the Black Panthers for the state of Israel? What would be their ideal structure, social, economic, political structure from their perspective back in the 1970s? How did they see that unfolding? What would be kind of the ultimate goal from their perspective?
Probably similar to like a Scandinavian welfare state, if you look at their platform, a much more democratic system of governance. If you look at even just like how the Likud was formed versus how labor was very top down, even though they called themselves socialists, where they selected all the local representatives for the party from the headquarters. With the Likud, everything was grassroots, and it came from the bottom, where the Likud allowed Mizrahim on the periphery of the country to like select their own leaders. And I think that is an ethos that came from the Panthers of like, they wanted power to come from the people. And but it was overall vague, right? They weren't like Marxists, they weren't ideologues. They wanted change. And they wanted better policy, and they had policy ideas, but they didn't have a full ideological platform.
I got you. All righty. Asaf, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for your comment. Thank you so much for the book. Very interesting, very insightful, very thought-provoking, and for your comments today. Thank you so much to the audience for attending today's webinar. The questions were awesome, and I hope that you benefited and enjoyed the conversation and the answers provided by Asaf. Please keep us in mind when you think about future events to attend. Visit us at www.israelstudies.umd.edu for more information and to register. Have a great evening. Stay safe. Oh, Asaf, you wanted to say something, please.
No, no. If anyone wants to keep the conversation going, find me online. I'm pretty easily findable. I'd love to hear from you. That's all.
Excellent. That's a wonderful plug-in. I think he's also active on social media,
Yeah.
unlike myself. Thank you so much, Asaf. Stay safe in LA. Everybody, have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Take care, folks.
Bye-bye.